In this video, we're going to talk about some of the main ideas in Chapter 2. And the main principle we want you to understand from Chapter 2 is that when you let people make their own decisions and make their own choices about what to do, what to buy, how to do things, that generally that leads to an outcome that is better than what you get if you have one dictator sitting at the top who pretends to know everything, who's making all of the decisions. First, let's stick with this idea of voluntary exchange. Voluntary means that I walk up to you and I say, hey, here I have a stapler. I don't need this stapler all that much, and I see that you have a few bottles of water. Can you and I make a trade? Can we make an exchange? And as long as you and I negotiate and we come to an agreement where what you're going to give me is worth more than the stapler is worth to me, and I give you the stapler, and to you the stapler is worth more than the bottles of water that you give me, that we are both happier. We are both made better off by this exchange. So as long as people are exchanging things in a voluntary way, this makes both people better off. So this is a fundamental principle in economics. One way to organize an economic system is what's called a command system or a command economy. So examples of a command economy are communism in the extreme or socialism in some ways. And the thing about a command economy is people don't make their own decisions about where to work, where to live, what they're allowed to buy. Markets don't determine these things. Some kind of government agency determines these things. Also, in socialism or communism, technically, who owns the factors of production, the land, the labor, and the capital, are the government. People typically don't own anything. So in a command economy, the state, the government owns everything. And central planning, some organization or some group of people decide what's going to be produced, how is it going to be produced, who gets the things that are produced, and how much do they get. Now, contrast that to a laissez-faire system. In the extreme, a laissez-faire system means everybody does what they want, when they want it, how they want it, and they do things the way they want to do it. Now, laissez-faire is a French phrase that literally translated, laisser means to allow, and faire means to do or to make. So to allow to do or to allow to make. So you just let people do, let people make whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want it. Sometimes this is called a capitalistic system, similar term, very closely related. And the idea here, when you have a laissez-faire system, is that there's private ownership of resources. People are the ones that own their own labor, their own land, the capital, and the entrepreneurship. You own your land, you own your own effort, and you get to decide what you want to do with it. Not true in former Soviet Union, not true in Cuba or in China in many cases. You get to do what the government says you're going to do. You're going to get paid what they say you're going to get paid, and if you don't like it, tough. So in a market system, or a laissez-faire system, how things are allocated, who gets what, and why things get produced are markets and prices. So markets is any place where buyers and sellers get together. Could be eBay, could be Amazon, could be Walmart, where people get together and they buy and they sell things. But markets and prices are what coordinate and direct economic activity. People see that if something's getting cheaper, they'll buy more of it. And people see that if things are getting more expensive, they'll decide to buy less of it, and maybe even getting into producing more of that. Prices are incentives. In a laissez-faire system, everybody makes choices in their own best interest. They decide what to do because they think that what they're doing is going to make themselves better off in some way. So in pure capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, the government really doesn't have a huge role. The main thing that a government is going to do in a laissez-faire system is set down some ground rules, set down a legal framework. For example, item number 1 here, we said there's private ownership of resources. One of the things government has to do is set down the rules for what do we mean by ownership. If you own a piece of land, what does that really mean? What are you allowed to do with it? Am I allowed to blow up my land with a nuclear weapon if I want to? Am I allowed to dump toxic waste on my land? Well, the government is going to have some things to say about what private ownership means. Most of the time, people will say that in the United States, we are a capitalist system, we are laissez-faire, we are a free market economy, but not totally. In the United States, the government really plays a very large role. The government decides a lot of things about what goes on in this country. So instead of calling the United States a pure capitalist system or a free market system, the United States is really best described as a mixed economy. A little bit of command and control, a little bit of socialism, and a good deal of capitalism. Let me give you a few examples of how in the United States we are a mixed economy. Let's think about a few different markets. 1, let's think about healthcare. Now, in a pure market system, healthcare, if I wanted some healthcare, I would go and buy it. And then there would be a doctor who would sell me the healthcare. And that would be it. But the government in the United States pays for most of the healthcare in the United States. And there's a lot of regulation about how healthcare can be provided. So whether we're talking about Medicaid for poor people, Medicare for old people, whether we're talking about the Veterans Administration for veterans or people in the military, or whether we're talking about Obamacare, the government of the United States pays for and regulates the healthcare market very, very closely. So that's not really a laissez-faire system where people are allowed to do things the way they want. Also in healthcare, there's a lot of regulation about who can be a doctor, who can buy or sell certain prescription medications, right? So there's a lot of rules where people aren't really allowed to do exactly what they want. Let me give you another example. What about the milk market in the United States? You might not be aware of this, but in the United States, the milk industry is extremely highly regulated. In a laissez-faire system, if I wanted to, I could go start a farm and I could buy some cows and I could start milking them and sell the milk. In the United States, that's illegal. It is illegal for me, Dr. Berkey, to go buy some cows, milk them, and start selling milk. Wild, isn't it? Pretty crazy. Also, the government of the United States doesn't allow prices of milk to just do whatever prices would do naturally in a market. The government of the United States sets the price of milk. Believe it or not, the price of milk is actually much higher in the United States than it would be if we just let the market do whatever it wanted to do. Have you ever heard of government cheese? Well, government cheese comes from the government, where they buy milk, they turn it into cheese, and then they give it away to poor people, or they give it away to school systems, or sometimes they'll take this government cheese and they'll ship it to another country, especially if there's a natural disaster. So this government interference in a market as simple as buying and selling milk clearly shows that we don't have a free market or a laissez-faire system. Now, let me show you one other example of a market where we don't have a free market, and that is the sugar market in the United States. Basically, ever since the founding of our country, the government has been involved in regulating the sugar market in strange ways. Now, let me show you a picture here. So this is your typical can of Coca-Cola. And when you look in the ingredients here, what do you see? Well, you see carbonated water. You see the second ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. So this is not sugar from sugarcane. High fructose corn syrup, it's sweet, but it's not the same thing as sugar. It tastes different. It's not quite as sweet. And also, there have been a lot of accusations recently that high fructose corn syrup is very bad for you. Why is it that Coca-Cola uses high fructose corn syrup? While in many countries, like when I go to Spain and I look at my Coca-Cola can, here is the list of ingredients. Number 1, carbonated water. Number 2, sugar. Real sugar that comes from sugar cane or from sugar beets. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. In the United States, we don't grow a lot of sugar ourselves. But the sugar that is grown in the United States, most of it is not sugar cane, it is sugar beets. We grow beets, we squeeze the juice, and we get the sugar out of it. For whatever reason, in the United States, I think I know the reason. It's probably because these people who grow sugar give campaign contributions to congressmen. But there's a policy in the United States that says that when people in the United States grow sugar, that they're going to get a much higher price than they should get when they sell that sugar. The government guarantees a minimum price, and that minimum price is about double what the world price of sugar is. So there are a lot of kind of crazy things that the government of the United States does when it comes to sugar. So this is a page from the United States Department of Agriculture's website. For some reason, they have this lovely picture of some people from Bangladesh up here. I'm not quite sure what the connection is. Talking about the sugar import program. Every country in the world has a certain amount of sugar that we are allowed to import from them into the United States. And every year, there's some group of people, right? This is definitely a command system. Some group of people that sits down and they decide, well, we're going to allow India to send us this amount of sugar, and Mexico this amount of sugar, and Honduras this amount of sugar. This amount of sugar that these countries are allowed to send us, they don't have to pay much in the way of import taxes on, or import tariffs on. Here it says, they allow a certain quantity of sugar to enter the country under a low tax, or a low tariff. Anything above that gets really taxed incredibly high. Why? Well, again, there's this powerful group of people who grow sugar in the United States, and they want to make sure that they're guaranteed their high level of profits for the sugar that they sell. Now, I don't know why sugar and milk are so special that people who make milk are supposed to make a whole lot of profit, and people who grow sugar are supposed to make a whole lot of profit. But people who grow potatoes, they don't get any special kind of deal. Kind of makes you think. It's kind of a crazy deal. So that's one part of the equation. Here's Pepsi made with real sugar, something that's not normal, but you can pay more, and you can get Pepsi Throwback, which is made with real sugar. And again, why don't they normally use sugar? Why do they use this high fructose corn syrup? And I'm sorry for how blurry this is, but basically the idea is that the sugar price in the United States, the red line here, is usually about double the world price, which is the green line down here on the bottom. Now, some people like the fact that the government is very involved in the economy, and they think the government can do a great job helping tell everybody what to do. And if the government will just handle everything, then things will be better. Well, history has shown us that this isn't really true. But different people have different political leanings, and I just wanted to mention those real quickly. There are different philosophies about how much government should you have involved in the economy, ranging from libertarian. Some people will call a libertarian a true or classical liberal. Now, the word liberty is built into the word here, libertarian, liberal, and this implies freedom. So if you are a libertarian, that means that you believe, typically, in personal freedom. You want to be able to do whatever you want with your life, live it the way you want, without anybody telling you how to live your life. You also want freedom from government interference in the economy. So a libertarian is somebody who would be typically mostly for a laissez-faire, free market, pure capitalist system. On the other hand, we have in the United States the Republican Party. And in the United States, the Republican Party is kind of a strange conglomeration of people who are pro-business. They like laissez-faire, mostly for business. They want businesses to have freedom to do whatever they want and do things the way they want, but they're typically not for individual people to have the freedom to do what they want. For example, Republicans are typically anti-drug. They don't want people to have the freedom to take drugs. They don't want gay people to have the freedom to be able to marry. They want to have some control over people's lives, but they want business to have freedom. That's typically what I think about a Republican. A centrist, somewhere in the middle. I see myself as a centrist. I see both sides of most arguments, although at some point you have to make a decision and make your recommendation. A Democrat, again, kind of a weird mishmash of people. Democrats typically want government control over the economy, but they want personal freedom. So a strange kind of mix. Typically, if you believe in freedom, you want to believe in freedom for both individual people as well as business freedom. And then you have socialists and communists. Communism, as you've probably heard, is a philosophy where you want everyone to have communal ownership of everything. And you want people to be able to, in a perfect world, give according to their abilities and take only according to their needs. Communism has been tried in many, many places in many different periods of time, and it just doesn't seem to work. People, most of the time, aren't willing to work extremely hard and then only take a tiny bit of what they need. Typically, in a socialist country, the government will own most of the property and the government will own most of the businesses and factories, but not totally. So this is kind of a continuum here between more freedom on one end, but you also have to think about whether you're thinking about, is it personal freedom or is it more economic freedom? Those are kind of two different dimensions that many people think about very differently, as evidenced by the difference between Republicans and Democrats. Now let me give you a couple of examples of how we see in various countries that the more socialism and the more communism you have in a country, typically things don't work out. Now this is easy to see in countries like China, Cuba, the former Soviet Union, in that the more government control you have, usually the less wealthy, the less happy, the less well-off people are in these countries. Two examples would be Venezuela and Exxon. For many years, Exxon, the oil company, has done business in Venezuela. Venezuela signed a contract with Exxon so that Exxon would go in and drill the oil, pump the oil, refine the oil. But then their government decided, let's just steal all of the infrastructure, all the pipes, all the factories that Exxon, all the oil wells that Exxon has built in Venezuela, and let's take them over. That way we get all this stuff for free, and then we get all the profits. We don't have to let Exxon earn anything from this. Another example is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe historically was an English colony, and the people in Zimbabwe resented the fact that most of the land, most of the good farmland at least, was owned by wealthy farmers. And these people were people from England generally. And the people in Zimbabwe eventually said, you know what? These white people shouldn't own this land. These white people should not own these farms. Let's go and confiscate the land, kick these people off, and then the government is going to take this land and divide it up among other people, and we'll be able to do things better. It'll be better for everyone. Let me show you what happened in these two cases. Case number one, Venezuela. When they kicked Exxon out of Venezuela, it was in this period of time in here. And what do you see has happened to the amount of oil? That's what's on the y-axis here. How much oil has Venezuela been pumping and selling abroad? We see that it's gone down, 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 especially right after they kicked Exxon out. Now, they recovered a little bit here, right, in 2009. But since then, they have never been able to get their amount of oil that they're producing anywhere near the levels that it was before. Also, another problem that Venezuela has had is just total mismanagement. It's not just how much oil they've been getting out of the ground, it's also how much money it has been costing Venezuela to get the oil out of the ground. The costs for the oil drilling, the oil pumping, and the oil refining, it's just been done much more inefficiently than it had been done before. And so Venezuela, by taking this property from Exxon, in the long run, has been much, much, much worse off. Typically, one of the problems is when you have a government that's willing to steal billions and billions of dollars from a company, usually what that government does with the things that they have just stolen is give them away to people who are their friends. So typically the people who are managing these oil fields and managing these pipelines are friends of people in the government. They're not necessarily the people who are qualified to do this kind of job. And in Zimbabwe, historically, for many, many decades, Zimbabwe was a huge exporter of food. Zimbabwe was one of the places that was considered like the breadbasket of Africa, providing a lot of the food for many other countries in Africa and indeed in other parts of the world. So when this policy actually went into effect, where the people were kicked off their land, was 2001 to 2002. There had been earlier policies passed trying to confiscate the land through the 90s in Zimbabwe. And some people had voluntarily given up their farms. Some of them sold their land voluntarily. But the time when it actually came that armed people went to the farms and started shooting people and actually kicking them off their land was in 2001 and 2002. Look at how much corn was being grown in the 1980s and in the 1990s. Between 1,000 and 2,000 kilograms per acre, right? This is the yield, is what we're looking at here. Kilograms per acre of farmland. What this is showing is after the land was being confiscated, even though they had the same amount of farmland, the amount of corn that was actually being grown and harvested on that land went from between 1,000 to 2,000 kilograms per acre down to a little bit higher than 500. What was happening with a lot of this land is it wasn't being divided up and given to deserving families, people who knew how to farm. It was being given to friends of people in the government. And these people did not know how to farm, and they were mismanaging it. And what happened over these years was Zimbabwe went from one of the largest exporters of food in Africa to one of the biggest importers of food in Africa. And a lot of people started starving because of this. Not a great policy when the government decides to take things. Let me show you this graph of the relationship between the ability of people to make decisions about economic things. What do I want to do with my life? How do I want to be trained? What job do I want? Can I open up a business and produce things the way I want, and then enter into voluntary exchange? We see here a relationship between per capita GDP. What does GDP stand for? It stands for gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is really just what is the value of everything produced inside a country over a given year. Per capita means per person. So if we take the value of all the stuff made in a country in a year and we divide it among all the people, how much stuff do we have? And this is one of the better ways to quickly get a grasp of what's the well-being of people in a country. There are a lot of other important things you should think about. But this, if you had to pick one thing, this is not a bad one. Per capita gross domestic product. And down here on the x-axis, we see a measure of economic freedom. It's called an economic freedom index. where basically you go through a checklist in a country and you ask questions about, okay, can people work where they want? Can people buy what they want? Can people live where they want? Can people open up a business to do what they want? If you're a business, can you produce things the way you want? So these are the kinds of things you would put in a checklist for economic freedom. So this is on the x-axis. And then over here on the y-axis, we have per capita GDP. And what we see when we fit a curve to these dots is this increasing line. We see a positive relationship between economic freedom and per capita GDP. When we look at some of the countries with the worst records for economic freedom, Venezuela, Angola, Zimbabwe down here at the bottom, we see that these are some of the poorest countries on earth. China, here somewhat in the middle, they have been opening up over the last 20 or 25 years, giving people in their country a little bit more economic freedom, and thus the country has been growing quite a bit. And here we see some of the Western countries and some of the Middle Eastern countries. Let's think about some of these. We see that the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait here have pretty high per capita GDP because they have a lot of oil. And they're not so high, but they're not so low on the Economic Freedom Index here. But a lot of their per capita GDP comes from the fact that they're sitting on big puddles of oil. Luxembourg here is a very teeny tiny country in Europe. They have extremely high per capita GDP because they're very well known as being a place kind of like Switzerland used to be, where if you have a bunch of money and you want to hide it, you put it in Luxembourg and they'll hide the money for you. But since they have this money in their banks, they get to use that money to earn interest and to invest in things. So they have a lot of income because they attract a lot of foreign deposits in their banks, which they can then lend out and make a lot of interest on. So these are some outliers here. Here we see the United States. We're fairly high on the Economic Freedom Index and fairly high when it comes to per capita GDP. So here it looks like per capita GDP is somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. This data is from about 10 years ago, though. So today, per capita GDP is closer to $50,000 if you want a number that is pretty accurate for the United States. $50,000 per person in gross domestic product in the United States. Here we see some countries in Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand in the Asia-Pacific region, which are very, very high on the Economic Freedom Index and also pretty high when it comes to the per capita GDP. So this relationship has been studied for about 100 years, and now there's even more interest in studying this relationship between what exactly are the things within these indexes of economic freedom that make a big difference. And there are a lot of the things that we've been talking about. These incentives to work, incentives to invest, incentives to make the best decisions so that you can be as happy as you can and make as much profit as you can. It turns out to be good for the country as a whole. So nobody is saying here that a pure capitalist system is perfect. But I just want to point out to you some of the very classic, common pitfalls we see when governments decide to take over industries. A lot of times they're mismanaged, run very inefficiently, and suffer from all kinds of problems that don't happen quite as often whenever we have a free market system. Now, I encourage everybody, if you haven't seen these shows, Shark Tank, excellent example of how capitalist systems are supposed to work. Watching entrepreneurs in action, also how it's made, show where you get to see how large factories are constructed using a lot of capital, a lot of machinery and buildings, producing things much more quickly and much more efficiently than you see in these communist or socialist countries most of the time. So how does a market system work? What are some of the characteristics we see? Well, first is the idea that private individual people, they're the ones, private individuals or groups of individuals who form business firms, own most of the private property in a country. And by private property, we mean not just the land, but also the capital, the buildings and machines are owned by people or groups of people. Now, in the United States, the government owns a lot of land, particularly out in the West and Midwest, but most of the land in the United States is owned by private individuals. Most of the companies and most of the factories are owned by private individuals. So one of the big principles of a capitalist or free market system is the idea of private property. Individuals own the property, and the rights they have, they can contract, they can obtain, they can control it, they can use it, rent it out, improve it, or sell this property to anybody they want. Private property rights. If people own the land and own the machines and the buildings, it allows people to make these voluntary trades, mutually agreeable transactions that we were talking about. And anytime I trade you this for that, we're both going to be better off as long as it is a voluntary trade. Another good thing about private property rights is if I own property, I have the incentive to invest in that property to make it better, to innovate, to make my machines better, faster, more efficient, more fuel efficient. I have the right and the incentives to trade property. If I can't use this property to its highest use, I'll sell it to somebody else or rent it to somebody else. And all of this encourages economic growth. Also, property rights involve intellectual property, patents, inventions, copyrights, trademarks. So there's an incentive to invent new ways and better ways of doing things. Secondly, freedom of enterprise and freedom of choice exist. So freedom of enterprise means if I want to start a business, I have the freedom to do that. I have the freedom to obtain resources and use those resources in a business. I have the freedom to produce what I want and to sell them to whoever I want to. Freedom of choice means the owners of property and money can use those resources however they want. I can live wherever I want. I can buy and sell whatever I want. Workers, individuals, can choose whatever occupation they want. So I can choose to study to become a doctor if I want to become a doctor. I can choose to be a welder. I can choose to be a professor if I want to. Believe it or not, if you haven't traveled to other countries and you haven't talked to a lot of other people about this, in many, many countries, you don't have this freedom. I know some people who have come to the United States from Cuba, and they are told where they're allowed to live. They were told what kind of job they were going to have. Some people are allowed to go and study to become a doctor or a chemist. Other people are not. It's not your choice. Just think about how that makes things inefficient. I might not want to be a doctor, but the government decides I'm going to be a doctor. What kind of doctor am I going to be if I didn't have the choice to do it? So freedom of choice also applies to freedom to spend your income however you want. You decide what you want to buy, and you buy it if you can afford it. So next big principle in free market economy is self-interest. I want to maximize my happiness or my utility. So self-interest, meaning I want to make myself better off. If I'm in a business, I want to maximize my profits or minimize my losses if my business isn't doing very well. If I have something to sell, whether I'm selling my labor or I'm selling the timber on my land or I'm selling the coal in my land, I want to maximize the income I can make from that. So as everybody's trying to maximize either their profits or their income or their utility, the economy is going to benefit because people are using their resources and their talents wisely as long as there's competition. So why is competition so important? Well, competition is a controlling mechanism. This competition means that if there are 2 or 3 businesses all producing the same thing, large numbers of sellers are going to mean that there's no single producer that can control the price in a market. We're all going to be fighting each other, trying to figure out ways to sell things more cheaply so that the customers want to come and buy from us. Also, we want a lot of buyers, though. a lot of buyers for our product means that no single consumer can control the price. I want you to think about this. Suppose you were making a product where there was only one buyer. Suppose you're thinking about making tanks. Well, in the United States, there's really only one person that's going to be buying tanks, right? And that's the United States military. So if there's only one buyer, they have a lot of control over you. You might want to sell tanks for $1 million a piece, but if there's only one buyer, they're going to say, no, we're not going to pay $1 million. You're going to sell us these tanks for $100,000 a piece, or we're not going to buy them. So when we talk about competition, we're talking about a lot of sellers to try to keep the selling end honest, but we also are talking about a lot of buyers, so that buyers are competing amongst themselves to buy what's available as well. Now, depending on market conditions, another part of competition, a lot of times in this class we'll talk about pure competition or perfect competition. We want a part of this way that markets are structured to be that producers can enter or leave markets easily. Why is this important? Well, we want prices to be able to send a signal. So, for instance, suppose that the price of corn triples or quadruples or goes up 10 times. Well, that is a signal that corn is valued. People want corn more than they used to. That's why they're willing to pay a lot more than they used to for it. A good thing is if producers can enter into the corn industry, they say, hey, price of corn went up. Maybe I should start farming corn instead of cotton or soybeans or rice or something like that. As more producers enter and supply more corn, that will tend to bring the price of corn back down. So it's a controlling mechanism. Having competition, it keeps the prices from getting out of control if producers can enter or leave. Similarly, if the price gets too low, producers are going to exit that industry and they're going to go do something else where they can make some more money. So the great thing about markets is that it's as if it's magic. When you have businesses who are trying to make the best decisions they can, and you have consumers trying to make the best decisions they can as well, the magic thing about a market system, it's not magic, but it kind of seems like it, is that a market system acts kind of like a big computer. It processes the decisions of all the buyers and the sellers for a product. So how much people want to buy something and the willingness of people to sell things all work together to determine the price of the market. And this price sends information to people. So the idea is that the market is whatever mechanism brings buyers and sellers together. And individual decisions by buyers and sellers in a market determine the product prices. So what's the price of a computer going to be? What's the price of a car going to be? And determines the resource prices. The price of the workers, the price of the land, the price of the machines and the buildings, the price that entrepreneurs need to get paid to compensate themselves. And these prices are going to guide further decisions by both the consumers and the resource owners and the producers. The people who can most quickly respond to those signals, who can respond to changes in prices, are going to be rewarded with profits. So for example, if I see that price of corn go up, and I can really quickly jump in, plow some land and plant some corn, I'm going to be able to be the one that takes advantage of those high prices and get the high profits from selling that corn. Another one of the main characteristics of a capitalist system or a laissez-faire system is that we tend to use a lot more technology and capital than command systems. If you look at the economy of Cuba, for example, or look at the economy of Vietnam that is controlled largely by communism and socialism, a command system, you just don't see the investment in infrastructure and buildings and the electrical system and factories that we have in the United States. Watch one of those episodes of How It's Made, and you're just not going to see those kinds of factories in Cuba. It just doesn't seem to happen for whatever reason. So the things we've been talking about, the competition, the freedom of choice, self-interest, and the drive to earn profits, provide the incentive to try to do things faster, better, and more cheaply. And that is an incentive for investment, capital accumulation. Capital accumulation means that if I have a business, I'm going to want to invest in more machines and more buildings and more technology so that I can produce more goods more quickly and more cheaply. That accumulation of capital is investment in productive resources, and that is what we see makes people in countries better off. So this investment in advanced technology makes people much better off. You have more output per person, and the more stuff you have per person, the more wealthy people in a society are going to be. It's not really the money that's important, it's what you can buy with that money. So when you're producing more things as a country, you're going to have a lot more things that the people can consume. Last couple of topics for this lecture are about specialization. So specialization is the idea that if everybody relied on just doing everything for themselves, you cook your own food, you build your own house, you're your own doctor, you make your own clothes. If everybody was self-sufficient in this way, and people never specialized in doing just one thing, people would be a lot worse off. Imagine if you had to do everything yourself. Well, you wouldn't have a cell phone, you wouldn't have a car, you wouldn't have much to eat, you wouldn't have much to wear. But by having people specialize and do what they're best at, and then trading, everybody's going to be better off. Let me share some quotes with you from Adam Smith about specialization. So Adam Smith was what most people consider the first economist. And he wrote this book back in 1776, the same year that we're famous for in the United States for declaring our independence from Britain. And we're in America. Adam Smith was actually in Britain at the time when he was writing this book. And his book was called An Inquiry or Investigation into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. An inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. What he was interested in was, why is it that some countries are richer and some countries are poorer? He was trying to dig down to the roots of what are the things that cause some nations to be wealthy and some nations to be very poor. And he had a lot of great insights from thinking about all of these things. So he talked a lot about trade and a lot about specialization and a lot about how economies work and a lot about how trade works. So let me start off with this quote about trade and the nature of the human experience in markets. Let me just read this to you and you can kick back for a minute and listen. So he says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." So butchers, brewers, and bakers don't give us our dinner because they care about us. They give us our dinner because they care about themselves, their own self-interest. They're selfish. That's why they give us food. What? They give us food because they're selfish? How does that work? Well, he says, look, if you want to eat, don't appeal to their humanity. Don't say, look, I'm a fellow human, give me some food. Instead, you appeal to their love of themselves. They don't love you, they love themselves. So how do you get them to give you food? Well, don't talk to them of your own necessities, but talk to them of their advantages. Tell them why it is a good thing for them to give you food. Tell them what you're going to give them in exchange, right? That is the way to get the food. So he says, nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly on the benevolence of his fellow citizens, but even a beggar doesn't depend on it entirely. The charity of well-disposed people indeed supplies him with the whole fund of his subsistence. So a beggar gets everything he needs from other people. But though this principle ultimately provides him with all the necessities of life that he has occasion for, it neither does nor can provide him with those things as he has occasion for them. So even though a beggar gets things from people, he doesn't necessarily get them when he needs them, right? Somebody might give you a sandwich, but maybe you don't need a sandwich right then. the greater part of his occasional wants are supplied in the same manner as those of other people, by treaty, by trading, by negotiation, in other words, by treaty, by barter, by trading, and by purchase. So somebody gives you some money, well, you're going to take that money and spend it just like anybody else, even if you're a beggar. With the money which one man gives him, he purchases food. The old clothes which somebody else bestows upon him, he exchanges for some other old clothes which suit him better. Or he trades them for lodging, or for food, or for money, with which he can buy whatever he needs, food, clothes, or lodging, as he has occasion, or as he needs those things. So he's saying here that the way to get what you want is through trade. Even if you're a beggar, you get some things, but that's not necessarily what you want, so you're going to take those things that people give you and you're going to trade them in some way anyway. So you don't get things you want by really saying, give them to me because you love me, but give them to me because you love yourself. It's all about voluntary exchange. Adam Smith goes on in his book and says things about how, in his opinion, this is what makes people human. He says nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog, right? It's people who enter into these exchanges and voluntary trades. The other really interesting thing about trade is, well, if you're going to trade, one of the best ways to trade is to get really good at doing something that people need. And if you get really good and you specialize in doing one thing, you'll be able to produce a lot more things that you can trade to people. And then by trading, you can get even more things for yourself. So Adam Smith went on a tour around the country, and one thing he saw is he went to a pen maker, P-I-N. And what he was talking about were these little straight pins. You got a little ball on one end and a really pointy end on the other. It's used for pinning cloth, or sometimes you'll buy a shirt that has some of these straight pins in it. And this was back in the 1700s. He went and witnessed a pen factory and saw how it worked. So he says here, take as an example a very trifling manufacturer, but one in which the division of labor, specialization, has been very often taken notice of. A workman not educated to this business, nor acquainted with the use of the machinery employed in it, could scarce perhaps with his utmost industry make one pin in a day. So I want you to think about this. Suppose I said, here's your homework for this week. Go and make me a straight pin from scratch. Could you do it? It might take you a whole day, is what he's saying, right? And even somebody who's really talented with tools. I'm pretty talented with tools. And he says, somebody could scarcely make 20, even if they were pretty darn talented with tools, making 20 pins in a day by themselves. I'd be kind of hard-pressed to make 20 in a day, even though I have modern tools. But in the way in which this business is now carried on in the 1700s, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it's divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. So he's saying each little part of making a pen is a specialization in itself. So he tells us about these specializations. One man draws out the wire, another one straightens it, a third person cuts it, a fourth person puts a point on it, a fifth person grinds the top of it flat for receiving the head, the little ball or the little flat part on top, so that you can grab the pin and pull it out of the cloth, right? And then he says to make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. And then to stick the head on the pin is a peculiar business. It's just one special thing that you have to know how to do really well, to take the head and stick it on the skinny pointy bit. And to whiten the pins is another. I'm not exactly sure what he means here, whether they painted them white or this is just something they did to clean them. It is even a trade by itself to put them into a piece of paper, so they would sell them in little pieces of paper where they'd have 20 or 30 pins in a little package. And the important business of making a pin is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by different people, distinct hands, though in others the same person will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of these jobs. So how many of these pens can you make if you have a lot of people who are very good at doing one little part of this job? He says, I saw in one factory of this kind where 10 men were employed, and where some of them had to perform 2 or 3 of these operations. But though they were very poor people and did not have very good equipment, they were but indifferently accommodated with machinery, right? So they didn't have any fancy tools. They could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in one day. And since in a pound of pins there are about 4,000 of them, those 10 people could make among them about 48,000 pins in one day. So that means that each person could make about 4,800 pins in a day. And again, this is hundreds of years ago, right? Without any fancy tools, 4,800 pins in one single day. Again, if you were trying to make them by yourself, it'd be hard to make one. But one person working together, specializing, really learning a job, can make a lot. So this is one of the benefits of specialization, but you can't have specialization unless you also have the ability to trade with people in markets. Because if I'm making 4,800 pins in a day, I can't eat them. So somebody has to go out there and sell them and then give me money, and then I can use money to go buy things. A lot of people criticize capitalism. They criticize this idea that, yeah, you can produce a lot of stuff by specializing and by having one little job where all I do all day long is sharpen a little piece of wire to make a pin, right? Suppose that's all I do every day. And you economists, you want to take all the humanity out of people. You don't want us to be happy and thrive and flourish. You want us to specialize and just be dumb machines our whole life. Well, we don't. Economics today, really what we focus on is the ultimate goal is to make people as happy as possible. We want people to flourish, whatever that means to the person themselves. But I just want to point out to you that even back in 1776, when Adam Smith wrote this book, he knew about this too, and he talked about it. Let me read you this point from Adam Smith on how, specialization is great, but it's also not that great in a few ways. So Adam Smith said, the man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects are perhaps always the same, or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients or better ways of doing things for removing difficulties which never occur. So if all you do is sit there and sharpen pens all day, you're not really able to use your brain to figure out a better way to do things. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion. He's not used to thinking. He loses his ability to think. And these people will generally become as stupid and as ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. And so Adam Smith understood that, yes, it is great to have specialization because we can produce more things that way. But on the other hand, there is something dehumanizing if all you do is basically the work of a machine all day. You're not thinking, you're not using your intellect, you're not using your creativity, that there is a downside here, and that we always need to be aware of this and think about this downside as we go about doing these things. So there needs to be some kind of balance brought to bear. So we're talking about laissez-faire capitalism and trade and all these things, specialization. So that's going to end this part of Chapter 2 lectures. We'll continue with Part 2 of Chapter 2. Please let me know what questions you have. I'd love to discuss these ideas further with you.